Forget the comforting fairy tales. The Ark was a pitch-black, floating tomb of boiling resin, starving apex predators, and the agonizing screams of a drowning humanity. Discover the blood-soaked, psychological nightmare of surviving the ultimate apocalypse. The desolate ending will shatter everything you thought you knew. Forget the pristine Renaissance murals. Forget the majestic white-bearded patriarch glowing under a divine halo, serenaded by harp-playing angels as pairs of cute animals march orderly onto a giant wooden cruise ship. It is all a monumental, comforting lie. The greatest deception we have been spoon-fed for centuries masks the most terrifying, blood-soaked, and insanely risky survival startup in the history of human existence. Imagine the sky bruising into a sickening shade of black, the air thick with the suffocating stench of impending doom, and the crushing realization that no magical crane, no power tools, and no divine wand will save your flesh from rotting in the abyssal waters. It was just humanity, an impending apocalypse, and a suicidal blueprint. At Vanyangayanchan 03 welcomes you to the brutal truth. If you are captivated by this dark reality and want to uncover the raw, unvarnished truths of history they never taught you, please hit that subscribe button right now to support the channel and give us the motivation to bring you even more mind-blowing content. Now, let us violently strip away that rosy mythological filter. When you look at the Great Flood through the ruthless, calculating eyes of a hardcore survivalist, the romanticized fairy tale shatters into pieces of jagged obsidian. The primordial reality was a suffocatingly savage landscape. Imagine being violently thrown into the heart of an unforgiving primeval forest, the barometric pressure dropping so fast it makes your ears ache, signaling a cataclysmic superstorm destined to wipe the face of the earth completely clean. And the creator upstairs did not hand down a magic spell, he delivered a conceptual death warrant: build a colossal ark, or prepare to be permanently eradicated. In an era where even the concept of a functional wheel was an absolute luxury, sitting around preaching hollow survival philosophy was completely meaningless. Every single obstacle had to be obliterated with agonizing muscle spasms, copious amounts of sweat, and a terrifying level of cruelty toward one's own physical limits. Our protagonist, the chief engineer and lead survivalist, was no serene, detached saint. Picture a desperate, mud-caked man with skin scorched black by a merciless sun. His hands were mangled, perpetually dripping blood from colossal wooden splinters that tore through his calluses. His eyes, deeply sunken and heavily bloodshot, burned with an indescribable exhaustion, yet radiated an absolutely unbreakable defiance. When the first primitive strikes of a crude stone hammer echoed through the forest, when the first foundational stake was violently driven into the parched earth beneath a brewing tempest, a profound realization hit: naked, agonizing physical labor is the true genesis of all miracles. If you do not carve the timber with your own bleeding hands, when the dark waters finally rise, you will simply be erased. There is no supernatural privilege to rescue the lazy. Surviving at this apocalyptic echelon is a vicious, hand-to-hand combat with nature herself, a merciless war where you must wield the rawest, most brutal elements of the earth just to stand a fleeting chance against its unfathomable wrath. That exact same brutal defiance, forged in the fires of raw physical agony, was the only force capable of overcoming the sheer, mind-bending logistical nightmare of the Ark's construction. We are talking about laying the keel of a vessel the length of a modern battleship using nothing but rudimentary Bronze Age hand tools and sheer human desperation. Try to visualize the agonizing logistics of harvesting massive, ancient cypress trees without a single steel saw, motorized winch, or hydraulic lift. Every massive trunk had to be painstakingly felled by repeated, bone-jarring strikes, then dragged miles through the unforgiving dirt by screaming muscles and fraying ropes. The sheer mathematical impossibility of the hull's architecture would have broken the minds of modern engineers. They had to interlock thousands of tons of rigid, unyielding timber perfectly enough to withstand the cataclysmic kinetic energy of tsunamis that would soon swallow mountain peaks. But the woodworking was only half the torture. To make this floating tomb watertight, the exterior and interior had to be entirely smothered in boiling pitch. Imagine the hellish conditions of rendering raw tar over massive, roaring open fires in the stifling heat of a dying climate. The thick, Acrid black smoke would have coated their lungs, burning their eyes and blistering their skin as they slathered the molten resin onto the rough wood. It was a highly toxic, highly flammable environment where one careless slip meant a gruesome, agonizing death covered in boiling sludge. This was not a peaceful family project filled with hymns and harmonious cooperation, it was a brutal, industrial-scale military operation executed by a hopelessly understaffed crew of terrified mortals. They were constantly racing against the darkening skies, their bodies breaking down under the compound stress of malnutrition, severe dehydration, and sleep deprivation. Every rusted wedge driven into the hull, every wooden peg hammered until the mallet splintered, was a desperate plea for another day of existence. The Ark was not a majestic ship designed for smooth sailing, it was an ugly, utilitarian, heavily armored black box built solely to absorb punishment, designed to take the most savage beating the earth had ever delivered and somehow remain entirely in one piece yet. Wrestling thousands of tons of dead timber into a watertight fortress was merely the physical prologue to a biological horror show that completely defies modern comprehension. The storybooks love to depict an orderly parade of docile, smiling creatures marching 2 by 2 up a clean wooden ramp, but the reality of packing wild, terrified fauna into a claustrophobic wooden box is a nightmare of epic proportions. As the barometric pressure plummeted and the sky bruised into an unnatural, apocalyptic purple, a primal panic seized the animal kingdom. These were not tame zoo exhibits, these were apex predators, massive herbivores, and venomous reptiles, all driven to the brink of madness by the unmistakable scent of their own impending extinction. The loading process would have been a chaotic, bloody scramble, a desperate attempt to force hyper-aggressive, panicking beasts into pitch-black wooden stalls. Once inside, the atmosphere immediately transformed into a suffocating miasma. Imagine the overwhelming, toxic stench of thousands of animals confined to a poorly ventilated space without a modern waste management system. The ammonia from their urine would have burned the eyes of the crew, while the combined body heat of massive mammals threatened to turn the lower decks into a lethal, humid oven. Then came the sheer psychological terror of the noise. It was a relentless, deafening cacophony of roaring, shrieking, bleating, and howling, the sounds of wild instincts colliding with the absolute terror of absolute confinement. The crew did not get to sit back and relax once the animals were aboard, they were instantly thrust into the roles of zookeepers in a floating madhouse. They had to navigate narrow, pitch-black corridors carrying heavy loads of grain and dried meat, constantly aware that only a few inches of crude wooden fencing separated them from starving carnivores. They were forced to meticulously balance the predator-prey proximity, ensuring the sheer stress of the environment did not trigger a bloodbath before the storm even hit. There was no divine sedation keeping the lions asleep or the bears calm. It was a 24-hour, high-stakes management of raw, volatile biology, a desperate struggle to keep the fragile ecosystem of the Ark from violently tearing itself apart from the inside out. When that colossal wooden door was finally levered shut and sealed from the outside with a thick coat of boiling resin, the desperate struggles of construction and containment were violently eclipsed by the deafening roar of total global annihilation. The moment the rain began, it was not the gentle, poetic weeping of the heavens, it was a weaponized deluge, a catastrophic rupturing of the atmosphere and the subterranean deep. The sky collapsed in a sheet of solid water, and the earth fractured beneath them, geysers of hyperpressurized magma and boiling water erupting to tear the crust apart. Inside the Ark, the sensory deprivation was absolute and terrifying. Plunged into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the flickering, oxygen-starved flames of crude oil lamps, the crew could not see the apocalypse unfolding, but they could feel every single agonizing second of it. The wooden hull, massive as it was, groaned and shrieked like a dying animal as it was lifted violently off the ground by churning, debris-filled tidal waves. Every time the pitch-black vessel was thrown into the trough of a mountainous swell, the occupants were hurled against the rough timber, violently nauseous and utterly powerless. The sheer acoustic trauma of the event would have been enough to shatter a fragile mind. Above the frantic bellowing of the panicked animals below deck, there was the apocalyptic thunder of millions of tons of water crashing down on the roof, the terrifying cracking of the timber beams bending under unnatural pressure, and worst of all, the sounds from outside. For those first few days, before the waters completely swallowed the highest peaks, the muffled cries of a drowning humanity, the screams of frantic crowds clawing at the impenetrable, tar-slicked exterior of the hull, would have haunted the crew's every waking moment. They were trapped in a floating coffin, perpetually waiting for the agonizing crack that would signal a hull breach, knowing that if a single major joint failed, the abyssal pressure of the deep would crush them instantly. They were entirely at the mercy of chaotic fluid dynamics, drifting blindly over a drowned planet, choking on the stench of animal filth and their own pervasive fear, entirely severed from the world they once knew, wrapped in a suffocating darkness that felt as though it would never, ever end. Only when the ceaseless, maddening roar of the tempest finally exhausted itself, replaced by an absolute and terrifying silence, did the true, psychological burden of their survival begin to crush them. The violent pitching of the ark eventually slowed to a stagnant, agonizing drift, but the relief of surviving the cataclysm was immediately poisoned by the dread of what awaited them outside the pitch-black wooden walls. The opening of the heavy timber door was not greeted by a vibrant, lush paradise, but by the blinding, unfiltered glare of a sun reflecting off a barren, apocalyptic wasteland. The water had receded, but it had stripped the earth down to its naked, mangled bedrock, leaving behind a suffocating, planet-wide layer of putrid, suffocating mud. As they finally stepped out of their dark, foul-smelling prison, their boots sank deep into a sterilized graveyard. The smell of the new world was not fresh pine and blooming flowers, it was the overwhelming, nauseating stench of mass decomposition. Millions of bloated carcasses, both human and animal, lay half-buried in a thick, gray sludge, a grim testament to the utter ruthlessness of the reset button that had just been pushed. This was the ultimate psychological test, far more agonizing than the backbreaking labor of building the vessel. The crew stood absolutely alone on a dead, silent sphere. There were no neighboring tribes to trade with, no ancient forests to forage, and no familiar landmarks to guide them. Everything they had ever known, loved, or hated had been violently erased from existence. They were the lonely inheritors of a ghost planet, tasked with the monumental, terrifying burden of repopulating a hostile, traumatized Earth from scratch. Every seed had to be planted in ruined soil, every shelter rebuilt from the splintered remnants of their past. The survivalists' journey did not end when the ark ran aground, it only mutated into a colder, lonelier battle against starvation, disease, and the profound, haunting grief of being the last ones left alive. They were not smiling victors walking into a sunset, they were battle-scarred veterans of the ultimate extinction event, staring out over a desolate horizon, knowing that the brutal, unforgiving work of staying alive had only just begun. The true story of the Ark is entirely divorced from the pastel-colored illustrations of children's books, it is a profound testament to the raw, unyielding grit of human endurance. Stripped of its mythological gloss, this narrative forces us to confront the terrifying reality of surviving an apocalyptic cataclysm. From the backbreaking, mathematically impossible logistics of constructing a colossal wooden fortress by hand, to the suffocating, toxic nightmare of managing a floating menagerie of panicked predators, every single phase of this journey was a brutal fight for continued existence. The crew endured the absolute sensory hell of global annihilation, trapped in pitch-black confinement while the world outside was violently erased, only to eventually disembark onto a sterilized, mud-drenched graveyard of a planet. Their survival was not a reward of comfort, but a transition into a profound, haunting isolation where they bore the crushing responsibility of rebuilding humanity from absolute zero. Ultimately, this narrative is not about waiting passively for a miraculous rescue, it is about the agonizing, relentless work required to survive the darkest storms imaginable. It strips away the illusion that survival is easy or beautiful, leaving behind the stark truth that true resilience is born in the darkest, most claustrophobic moments of our lives, forged by individuals who refuse to surrender even when the entire world is literally tearing itself apart. Resilience is never a passive state of grace, it is an active, often agonizing choice. The Ark was built long before the rain ever started, proving that surviving life's most catastrophic storms requires brutal, proactive preparation and the willingness to endure deep discomfort. True survival isn't about escaping pain or hoping the storm passes you by, it is about deliberately building the capacity to withstand extreme pressure when the world around you collapses, and possessing the psychological fortitude to step out of the wreckage to rebuild from absolute nothingness. Build your ark early, do not wait for a crisis to start preparing. Whether it is building an emergency financial fund, learning a crucial new skill, or forging a strong mental health foundation, put in the grueling, unglamorous work now so your personal vessel is watertight before tragedy strikes. Embrace the ugly work. Success and survival are rarely pretty. Stop looking for the sanitized, friction-free path. Embrace the stress, the discipline, and the daily grind required to fortify your life. The heavy lifting you avoid today is the structural weakness that will sink you tomorrow. Accept the desolate dawn. When you survive a major life crisis, such as a crushing failure, a severe illness, or a heartbreak, do not expect life to instantly return to normal. Acknowledge the barren landscape of your new reality, mourn what was lost, and take full ownership of planting new seeds in ruined soil. If you knew a massive storm or crisis was coming in your own life next year, what is the very first thing you would do right now to start building your personal ark? Please share your thoughts down in the comments below. We would love to read your perspectives and learn how you approach life's toughest challenges. If you found value in this deep, realistic perspective, please hit that subscribe button. Your support gives us the drive and motivation to keep creating more thought-provoking, high-quality content for you.